everybody. Hope you all are doing well tonight. I wanted to say I let you all know I thank you for your comments and your posts on my posting the link of the first part of this reading of the Chronicles of Narnia last night. I'm glad you all are enjoying it, and thank you for your kind words. I think right now being open and honest about how I'm feeling is a big help. I can't do anything else but, so trying a different setup tonight. I'm actually sitting on the bed in the bedroom. My poor iMac. I think it was having a little bit of trouble with processing and saving and uploading the video last night. So I thought maybe I'd try recording on my laptop tonight because I kind of want to keep the iMac in decent condition because that's where I'm working from home. So I have to be kind of nice to it because, well, I don't want it to die. Not right now. So I actually have company tonight while I'm doing this. If I can turn my laptop around and not accidentally stop the video. If I can do this would be cool. Jax is here. Right now he's just chilling, giving himself his evening bath. There you go, buddy. Yeah, getting all the floof nice and clean. I think he's wondering why I'm back here like this when it's just about bedtime for the humans. Now he's looking at me like, what are you doing? This is my private time. But yeah, I do think he knows our schedule's off. I think he's used to David and I going out on a Sunday morning, and he gets to sleep for 2-3 hours while we're at church and everywhere. So I think it was a little strange for him this morning that we were both here, that he doesn't get to sleep on David's reclining sitting gaming cushion in the living room. He likes to nap on that while we're not here. So, but that's okay. I'm hoping that I can maybe come up with a replication of my routine, getting up, getting ready for work, and that kind of thing. So maybe that'll keep some normalcy while I'm working from home for him. And David will be off tomorrow, so he'll have somebody to pet him and pay attention to him and scream at. So that's about where we are today. Actually, you'll have to forgive me. I may grab this and have a drink from time to time or between chapters. I noticed last night that talking a lot really dries my throat out. So I figure it's better to have something here to make sure it doesn't get too dry. I have a feeling this thing is gonna not want to behave tonight. Oh well. So hopefully this won't take too long tonight. I've had a couple stops and starts with the video. I'm not quite sure what's going on. So I'm trying to figure it out. So without further ado, I will get back to the Magician's Nephew, where we left off, which would be Chapter 3, The Wood Between the Worlds. Uncle Andrew and his study vanished instantly. Then for a moment everything became muddled. The next thing Diggory knew was that there was a soft green light coming down on him from above, and darkness below. He didn't seem to be standing on anything, or sitting, or lying. Nothing appeared to be touching him. "I believe I'm in water," said Diggory. "Or underwater." This frightened him for a second, but almost at once he could feel that he was rushing upwards. Then his head suddenly came out into the air, and he found himself scrambling ashore, out onto smooth grassy ground at the edge of a pool. As he rose to his feet, he noticed that he was neither dripping nor panting for breath, as anyone would expect after being underwater. His clothes were perfectly dry. He was standing by the edge of a small pool, not more than 10 feet from side to side in a wood. The trees grew close together and were so leafy that he could get no glimpse of the sky. All the light was green light that came through the leaves. But there must have been a very strong sun overhead, for this green daylight was bright and warm. Excuse me. It was the quietest wood you could possibly imagine. There were no birds, no insects, no animals, and no wind. You could almost feel the trees growing. The pool he had just got out of was not the only pool. There were dozens of others, a pool every few yards as far as his eyes could reach. You could almost feel the trees drinking the water up with their roots. This wood was very much alive. When he tried to describe it afterwards, Diggory always said, "It was a rich place, as rich as plum cake." The strangest thing was that, almost before he had looked about him, Diggory had half forgotten how he had come there. At any rate, he was certainly not thinking about Polly, or Uncle Andrew, or even his mother. He was not in the least frightened, or excited, or curious. If anyone had asked him, "Where did you come from?" he probably would have said, "I've always been here." That was what it felt like, as if one had always been in that place and never been bored, although nothing had ever happened. As he said long afterwards, "It's not the sort of place where things happen. The trees go on growing. That's all." After Diggory had looked at the wood for a long time, he noticed that there was a girl lying on her back at the foot of a tree a few yards away. Her eyes were nearly shut, but not quite, as if she were just between sleeping and waking. So he looked at her for a long time and said nothing. And at last she opened her eyes and looked at him for a long time, and she also said nothing. Then she spoke in a dreamy, contented sort of voice. "I think I've seen you before," she said. "I rather think so too," said Diggory. "Have you been here long?" "Oh, always," said the girl. "At least, I don't know, a very long time." "So have I," said Diggory. "No, you haven't," she said. "I've just seen you come up out of that pool." "Yes, I suppose I did," said Diggory with a puzzled air. "I'd forgotten." Then for quite a long time neither said any more. "Look here," said the girl presently. "I wonder, did we ever really meet before? I had a sort of idea, a sort of picture in my head of a boy and a girl like us, living somewhere quite different and doing all sorts of things. Perhaps it was only a dream." "I've had that same dream, I think," said Diggory, "about a boy and a girl living next door, and something about crawling among rafters. I remember the girl had a dirty face." "Aren't you getting it mixed? In my dream it was the boy who had the dirty face." "I can't remember the boy's face," said Diggory, and then added, "Hello, what's that?" "Why, it's a guinea pig," said the girl. And it was a fat guinea pig nosing about in the grass. But round the middle of the guinea pig there ran a tape, and tied on to it by the tape was a bright yellow ring. "Look, look," cried Diggory, "the ring, and look, you've got one on your finger, and so have I." The girl now sat up, really interested at last. They stared very hard at one another, trying to remember. And then at exactly the same moment she shouted out Mr. Ketterly, he shouted out Uncle Andrew, and they knew who they were and began to remember the whole story. After a few minutes' hard talking that they had got it straight, Diggory explained how beastly Uncle Andrew had been. "What do we do now?" said Polly. "Take the guinea pig and go home?" "There's no hurry," said Diggory with a huge yawn. "I think there is," said Polly. "This place is too quiet. It's so dreamy. You're almost asleep. If we once give in to it, we shall just lie down and drowse forever and ever." "It's very nice here," said Diggory. "Yes, it is," said Polly, "but we've got to get back." She stood up and began to go cautiously toward the guinea pig. But then she changed her mind. "We might as well leave the guinea pig," she said. "It's perfectly happy here, and your uncle will only do something horrid to it if we take it home." "I bet he would," answered Diggory. "Look at the way he's treated us. By the way, how do we get home?" "Go back in the pool, I expect." They came and stood together at the edge, looking down into the smooth water. It was full of the reflection of the green leafy branches. They made it look very deep. "We haven't any bathing things," said Polly. "We shan't need them, silly," said Diggory. We're going in with our clothes on. Don't you remember it didn't wet us on the way up? Can you swim? A bit. Can you? Well, not much. I don't think we shall need to swim, said Diggory. We want to go down, don't we? Neither of them much liked the idea of jumping into that pool, but neither said so to the other. They took hands and said 1, 2, 3, go, and jumped. There was a great splash, and of course they closed their eyes. But when they opened them again, they found they were still standing, hand in hand in the green wood, and hardly up to their ankles in water. The pool was apparently only a couple of inches deep. They splashed back onto the dry ground. What on earth's gone wrong? Said Polly in a frightened voice, but not quite so frightened as you might expect, because it is hard to feel really frightened in that wood. The place is too peaceful. Oh, I know, said Diggory. Of course it won't work. We're still wearing our yellow rings. They're for the outward journey, you know. The green ones take you home. We must change rings. Have you got pockets? Good. Put your yellow ring in your left. I've got 2 greens. Here's one for you. They put on their green rings and came back to the pool. But before they tried another jump, Diggory gave a long, "Oh." "What's the matter?" said Polly. "I've just had a really wonderful idea," said Diggory. "Where are all the other pools?" "How do you mean?" "Why, if we can't get back to our own world by jumping into this pool, mightn't we get somewhere else by jumping into one of the others? Suppose there was a world at the bottom of every pool." "But I thought we were already in your Uncle Andrew's other world or other place or whatever he called it." Didn't you say—" "Oh, bother Uncle Andrew," interrupted Diggory. "I don't believe he knows anything about it. He never had the pluck to come here himself. He only talked of one other world. But suppose there were dozens." "You mean this wood might be only one of them?" "No, I don't believe this wood is a world at all. I think it's just sort of an in-between place." Polly looked puzzled. "Don't you see?" said Diggory. "No, do listen. Think of our tunnel under the slates at home. It isn't a room in any of the houses. In a way, it isn't really part of any of the houses. But once you're in the tunnel, you can go along it and come into any of the houses in the row. Mightn't this wood be the same, a place that isn't in any of the worlds, but once you've found that place, you can get into them all?" "Well, even if you can—" began Polly, but Diggory went on as if he hadn't heard her. "And of course that explains everything," he said. "That's why it is so quiet and sleepy here. Nothing ever happens here. Like at home. It's in the houses that people talk and do things and have meals. Nothing goes on in the in-between places between the walls and above the ceilings and under the floor or in our own tunnel. But when you come out of our tunnel, you may find yourself in any house. I think we can get out of this place into jolly well anywhere. We don't need to jump back into the same pool we came up by. Or not just yet." "The wood between the worlds," said Polly dreamily. "It sounds rather nice." "Come on," said Diggory. "Which pool shall we try?" "Look here," said Polly. "I'm not going to try any new pool till we've made sure that we can get back to the old one. We're not even sure if it'll work yet." "Yes," said Diggory, "and get caught by Uncle Andrew and have our rings taken away before we've had any fun. No thanks." "Couldn't we just go part of the way down into our own pool?" said Polly. "Just to see if it works. Then if it does, we'll change rings and come up again before we're really back in Mr. Ketterly's study." "Can we go part of the way down?" "Well, it took time coming up. I suppose it'll take a little time going back." Diggory made rather a fuss about agreeing to this, but he had to in the end, because Polly absolutely refused to do any exploring in new worlds until she had made quite sure about getting back to the old one. She was quite as brave as he about some dangers, wasps for instance, but she was not so interested in finding out things nobody had ever heard of before. For Diggory, who was the sort of person who wants to know everything, and when he grew up he became the famous Professor Kirk, who comes into other books. After a good deal of arguing, they agreed to put on their green rings. "Green for safety," said Diggory, "so you can't help remembering which is which, and hold hands and jump." But as soon as they seemed to be getting back to Uncle Andrew's study or even to their own world, Polly was to shout "Change!" and they would slip off their greens and put on their yellows. Diggory wanted to be the one who shouted changed, but Polly wouldn't agree. They put on the green rings and once more shouted 1, 2, 3, go. This time it worked. At first there were bright lights moving about in a black sky. Diggory always thought these were stars and even swears that he saw Jupiter quite close, close enough to see its moon. But almost at once there were rows and rows of roofs and chimney pots about them, and they could see St. Paul's and knew they were looking at London. But you could see through the walls of all the houses. Then they could see Uncle Andrew very vague and shadowy, but getting clearer and more solid looking all the time, just as if he were coming into focus. But before he became quite real, Polly shouted, change! And they did change, and our world faded away like a dream, and the green light above grew stronger and stronger, till their heads came out of the pool and they scrambled ashore. And there was the wood all about them, as green and bright and still as ever. The whole thing had taken less than a minute. There, said Diggory, that's all right. Now for the adventure. Any pool will do. Come on, let's try that one. Stop, said Polly. Aren't we going to mark this pool? They stared at each other and turned quite white as they realized the dreadful thing that Diggory had just been going to do. For there were any number of pools in the wood, and the pools were all alike, and the trees were all alike, so that if they had once left behind the pool that led to our world, without making some sort of landmark, the chances would have been 100 to 1 against their ever finding it again. Diggory's hand was shaking as he opened his penknife and cut out a long strip of turf on the bank of the pool. The soil, which smelled nice, was of a rich reddish brown and showed up well against the green. It's a good thing one of us has some sense, said Polly. Well, don't keep on gassing about it, said Diggory. Come along. I want to see what's in one of the other pools. And Polly gave him a pretty sharp answer, and he said something even nastier in reply. The quarrel lasted for several minutes, but it would be dull to write it all down. Let us skip on to the moment at which they stood with beating hearts and rather scared faces on the edge of the unknown pool with their yellow rings on, and held hands, and once more said, 1, 2, 3, go! Splash! Once again it hadn't worked. This pool, too, appeared to be only a puddle. Instead of reaching a new world, they only got their feet wet and splashed their legs for the second time that morning. If it was a morning, it always seemed to be the same time in the wood between the worlds. Blast and botheration, exclaimed Diggory. What's gone wrong now? We've put our yellow rings on all right. He said yellow for the outward journey. Now the truth was that Uncle Andrew, who knew nothing about the wood between the worlds, had quite a wrong idea about the rings. The yellow ones weren't outward rings, and the green ones weren't homeward rings, at least not in the way he thought. The stuff of which both were made had all come from the wood. The stuff in the yellow rings had the power of drawing you into the wood. It was stuff that wanted to get back to its own place, the in-between place. But the stuff in the green rings is stuff that is trying to get out of its own place, so that a green ring would take you out of the wood into a world. Uncle Andrew, you see, was working with things he really did not understand. Most magicians are. Or, of course, Diggory did not realize the truth quite clearly either, or not till later. But when they had talked it over, they decided to try their green rings on the new pool, just to see what happened. I'm game if you are, said Polly. But she really said this because in her heart of hearts she now felt sure that neither kind of ring was going to work at all in the new pool, and so there was nothing worse to be afraid of than another splash. I am not quite sure that Diggory had not the same feeling. At any rate, when they had both put on their greens and come back to the edge of the water and taken hands again, they were certainly a good deal more cheerful and less solemn than they had been the first time. 1, 2, 3, go, said Diggory, and they jumped. Chapter 4. The Bell and the Hammer. There was no doubt about the magic this time. Down and down they rushed, first through darkness, and then through a maze of vague and whirling shapes which might have been almost anything. It grew lighter. Then suddenly they felt that they were standing on something solid. A moment later everything came into focus, and they were able to look then about them. "What a queer place," said Diggory. "I don't like it," said Polly, with something like a shudder. What they noticed first was the light. It wasn't sunlight, and it wasn't like electric light, or lamps, or candles, or any other light they had ever seen. It was a dull, rather red light, not at all cheerful. It was steady and did not flicker. They were standing on a flat paved surface, and buildings rose all around them. There was no roof overhead. They were in a sort of courtyard. The sky was extraordinarily dark, a blue that was almost black. When you had seen that sky, you wondered that there should be any light at all. "It's very funny weather here," said Diggory. "I wonder if we've arrived just in time for a thunderstorm or an eclipse." "I don't like it," said Polly. Both of them, without quite knowing why, were talking in whispers, and though there was no reason why they should still go on holding hands after their jump, they didn't let go. The walls rose very high all around that courtyard. They had many great windows in them, windows without glass, through which you saw nothing but black darkness. Lower down there were great pillared arches, yawning blackly like the mouths of railway tunnels. It was rather cold. The stone of which everything was built seemed to be red, but the excuse me. Sorry about that. It's time for a quick drink. Sorry, folks. Sorry about that. The stone of which everything was built seemed to be red, but that might only be because of the curious light. It was obviously very old. Many of the flat stones that paved the courtyard had cracks across them. None of them fitted closely together, and the sharp corners were all worn off. One of the arched doorways was half filled up with rubble. The two children kept turning round and round to look at the different sides of the courtyard. One reason was that they were afraid of somebody or something looking out of those windows at them when their backs were turned. "Do you think anyone lives here?" said Diggory at last, still in a whisper. "No," said Polly. "It's all in ruins. We haven't heard a sound since we came." "Let's stand still and listen for a bit," suggested Diggory. They stood still and listened, but all they could hear was the thump-thump of their own hearts. This place was at least as quiet as the wood between the worlds, but it was a different kind of quietness. The silence of the wood had been rich and warm. You could almost hear the trees growing, and full of life. This was a dead, cold, empty silence. You couldn't imagine anything growing in it. "Let's go home," said Polly. "But we haven't seen anything yet," said Diggory. "Now we're here, we must simply have a look round. I'm sure there's nothing at all interesting here. There's not much point in finding a magic ring that lets you into other worlds if you're afraid to look at them when you've got there." "Who's talking about being afraid?" said Polly, letting go of Diggory's hand. "I only thought you didn't seem very keen on exploring this place." "I'll go anywhere you go." "We can get away the moment we want to," said Diggory. "Let's take off our green rings and put them in our right-hand pockets. All we've got to do is to remember that our yellows are in our left-hand pockets. You can keep your hand as near your pocket as you like, but don't put it in, or you'll touch your yellow and vanish." They did this and went quietly up to one of the big arched doorways which led into the inside of the building, and when they stood on the threshold and could look in, they saw it was not so dark inside as they had thought at first. It led into a vast, shadowy hall which appeared to be empty, but on the far side there was a row of pillars with some arches between them, and through those arches there streamed in some more of the same tired-looking light. They crossed the hall very carefully for fear of holes in the floor or of anything lying about that they might trip over. It seemed a long walk. When they had reached the other side, they came out through the arches and found themselves in another and larger courtyard. "That doesn't look very safe," said Polly, pointing at a place where the wall bulged outward and looked as if it were ready to fall over into the courtyard. In one place a pillar was missing between two arches, and the bit that came down to where the top of the pillar was ought to have been hung there with nothing to support it. Clearly the place had been deserted for hundreds, perhaps thousands of years. If it lasted till now, I suppose it'll last a bit longer, said Diggory. But we must be very quiet. You know a noise sometimes brings things down, like an avalanche in the Alps. They went out of that courtyard into another doorway, and up a great flight of steps and through vast rooms that opened out of one another until you were dizzy with the mere size of the place. Every now and then they thought they were going to get out into the open and see what sort of country lay around the enormous palace, but each time they only got into another courtyard. They must have been magnificent places when people were still living there. In one there had been a fountain. A great stone monster with widespread wings stood with its mouth open, and you could see a bit of piping at the back of its mouth, out of which the water used to pour. Under it was a wide stone basin to hold the water, but it was as dry as a bone. In other places there were the dry sticks of some sort of climbing plant which had wound itself round the pillars and helped to pull some of them down. But it had died long ago, and there were no ants or spiders or any of the other living things you expect to see in a ruin, and where the dry earth showed between the broken flagstones, there was no grass or moss. It was all so dreary and all so much the same that even Diggory was thinking they had better put on their yellow rings and get back to the warm, green, living forest of the in-between place where they came when they came to two huge doors of some metal that might possibly be gold. One stood a little ajar. So, of course, they went to look in. Both started back and drew a long breath, for here at last was something worth seeing. For a second they thought the room was full of people, hundreds of people, all seated and all perfectly still. Polly and Diggory, as you may guess, stood perfectly still themselves for a good long time, looking in. But presently they decided that what they were looking at could not be real people. There was not a movement nor the sound of a breath among them at all. They were like the most wonderful waxworks you ever saw. This time Polly took the lead. There was something in the room that interested her more than it interested Diggory. All the figures were wearing magnificent clothes. If you were interested in clothes at all, you could hardly help going in to see them closer. And the blaze of their colors made this room look not exactly cheerful, but at any rate rich and majestic after all the dust and emptiness of the others. It had more windows and was a good deal lighter. I can hardly describe the clothes. The figures were all robed and had crowns on their heads. Their robes were of crimson and silvery gray, and deep purple and vivid green, and there were patterns and pictures of flowers and strange beasts, and in needlework all over them. Precious stones of astonishing size and brightness stared from their crowns, and hung in chains round their necks, and peeped out from all the places where anything was fastened. "Why haven't these clothes all rotted away long ago?" asked Polly. "Magic," whispered Diggory. "Can't you feel it? I bet this whole room is just stiff with enchantments. I could feel it the moment we came in. Any one of these dresses would cost hundreds of pounds," said Polly. But Diggory was more interested in the faces, and indeed these were well worth looking at. The people sat in their stone chairs on either side of the room, and the floor was left free down the middle. You could walk down and look at the faces in turn. "They were nice people, I think," said Diggory. Polly nodded. All the faces they could see were certainly nice. Both the men and the women looked kind and wise, and they seemed to come of a handsome race. But after the children had gone a few steps down the room, they came to faces that looked a little different. These were very solemn faces. You felt you would have to mind your P's and Q's if you ever met living people who looked like that. When they had gone a little further, they found themselves among faces that they didn't like. This was about the middle of the room. The faces here looked very strong and proud and happy, but they looked cruel. A little further on they looked crueler. Further on again they were still cruel, but they no longer looked happy. There were even despairing faces, as if the people they belonged to had done dreadful things, and also suffered dreadful things. The last figure of all was the most interesting, a woman even more richly dressed than the others. Very tall, but every figure in that room was taller than the people of our world, with a look of such fierceness and pride that it took your breath away. Yet she was beautiful, too. Years afterward, when he was an old man, Diggory said he had never in all his life known a woman so beautiful. It is only fair to add that Polly always said she couldn't see anything specially beautiful about her. The woman, as I said, was the last, but there were plenty of empty chairs beyond her, as if the room had been intended for a much larger collection of images. I do wish we knew the story that's behind all this, said Diggory. Let's go back and look at that table sort of thing in the middle of the room. The thing in the middle of the room was not exactly a table. It was a square pillar about 4 feet high, and on it there rose a little golden arch, from which there hung a little golden bell, and beside this there lay a little golden hammer to hit the bell with. I wonder, said Diggory. There seems to be something written here, said Polly, stooping down and looking at the side of the pillar. By gum, so there is, said Diggory, but of course we shan't be able to read it. Shan't we? I'm not so sure, said Polly. They both looked at it hard, and as you might have expected, the letters cut in the stone were strange. But now a great wonder happened, for as they looked, though the shape of the strange letters never altered, they found they could understand them. If only Diggory had remembered what he himself had said a few minutes ago, that this was an enchanted room, he might have guessed that the enchantment was beginning to work. But he was too wild with curiosity to think about that. He was longing more and more to know what was written on the pillar. And very soon they both knew. What it said was something like this. At least, this is the sense of it through the poetry. When you read it there was better. Make your choice, adventurous stranger. Strike the bell and bide the danger. Or wonder, till it drives you mad, what would have followed if you had. No fear, said Polly. We don't want any danger. Oh, but don't you see it's no good, said Diggory. We can't get out of it now. We shall always be wondering what else would have happened if we had struck the bell. I'm not going home to be driven mad by always thinking of that. No fear. Don't be so silly, said Polly. As if anyone would. What does it matter what would have happened? I expect anyone who's come as far as this is bound to go on wondering till it sends him dotty. That's the magic of it. You see, I can feel it beginning to work on me already. Well, I don't, said Polly crossly. And I don't believe you do either. You're just putting it on. That's all you know, said Diggory. It's because you're a girl. Girls never want to know anything but gossip and rot about people getting engaged. You look exactly like your uncle when you said that, said Polly. Why can't you keep to the point, said Diggory. What we're talking about is how exactly like a man, said Polly in a very grown-up voice, but she would add it hastily in her real voice. And don't say I'm just like a woman or you'll be a beastly copycat. I should never dream of calling a kid like you a woman, said Diggory loftily. Oh, I'm a kid, am I? Said Polly, who was now in a real rage. Well, you needn't have bothered by having a kid with you any longer then. I'm off. I've had enough of this place. And I've had enough of you, too, you beastly, stuck-up, obstinate pig. None of that, said Diggory in a voice even nastier than he meant it to be, for he saw Polly's hand moving to her pocket to get hold of her yellow ring. I can't excuse what he did next except by saying that he was very sorry for it afterwards, and so were a good many other people. Before Polly's hand reached her pocket, he grabbed her wrist, leaning across with his back against her chest. Then, keeping his other arm out of the way with his other elbow, he leaned forward, picked up the hammer, and struck the golden bell a light, smart tap. Then he let her go, and they fell apart, staring at each other and breathing hard. Polly was just beginning to cry, not with fear, not even because he had hurt her wrist quite badly, but with furious anger. Within 2 seconds, however, they had something to think about that drove their own quarrels quite out of their minds. As soon as the bell was struck, it gave out a note, a sweet note such as you might have expected, and not very loud. But instead of dying away again, it went on, and as it went on, it grew louder. Before a minute had passed, it was twice as loud as it had been to begin with. It was soon so loud that if the children had tried to speak, but they weren't thinking of speaking now, they were just standing with their mouths open, they would not have heard one another. Very soon it was so loud that they could not have heard one another even by shouting. And still it grew, all on one note, a continuous sweet sound, though the sweetness had something horrible about it, till the air in that great room was throbbing with it, and they could feel the stone floor trembling under their feet. Then at last it began to be mixed with another sound, a vague, disastrous noise, which sounded first like the roar of a distant train, and then like the crash of a falling tree. They heard something like great weights falling. Finally, with a sudden rush and thunder, and a shake that nearly flung them off their feet, about a quarter of the room at one end of the room fell in. Great blocks of masonry fell all around them, and the walls rocked. The noise of the bell stopped. The clouds of dust cleared away. Everything became quiet again. It was never found out whether the fall of the roof was due to magic, or whether that unbearably loud sound from the bell just happened to strike the note, which was more than those crumbling walls could stand. "There, I hope you're satisfied now," panted Polly. "Well, it's all over anyway," said Diggory. And both thought it was, but they had never been more mistaken in their lives. Chapter 5. The Deplorable Word. The children were facing one another across the pillar when the bell rung, where the bell hung, still trembling, though it no longer gave any note, which was still undamaged. Though it no longer gave out any note. Suddenly they heard a soft noise from the end of the room, which was still undamaged. They turned quick as lightning to see what it was. One of the robed figures, the furthest off one of all, the woman whom Diggory thought so beautiful, was rising from its chair. When she stood up, they realized that she was even taller than they had thought. And you could see not at once, not only from her crown and robes, but from the flash of her eyes and the curve of her lips, that she was a great queen. She looked round the room and saw the damage, and saw the children, but you could not guess from her face what she thought of either, or whether she was surprised. She came forward with long, swift strides. "Who has awakened me? Who has broken the spell?" she asked. "I think it must have been me," said Diggory. "You," said the queen, laying her hand on his shoulder, a white, beautiful hand, but Diggory could feel that it was strong as steel pincers. "You? But you're only a child, a common child. Anybody can see at a glance that you have no drop of royal or noble blood in your veins. How did such as you dare to enter this house?" "We've come from another world, by magic," said Polly, who thought it was high time the queen took some notice of her as well as of Diggory. "Is this true?" said the queen, still looking at Diggory and not giving Polly even a glance. "Yes, it is," said he. The queen put her other hand under his chin and forced it up so that she could see his face better. Diggory tried to stare back, but he soon had to let his eyes drop. There was something about hers that overpowered him. After she had studied him for well over a minute, she let go of his chin and said, "You are no magician. The mark of it is not on you. You must be only the servant of a magician. It is on another's magic that you have traveled here." "It was my Uncle Andrew," said Diggory. At that moment, not in the room itself, but from somewhere very close, there came, first a rumbling, then a creaking, and then a roar of falling masonry, and the floor shook. "There is great peril here," said the queen. "The whole palace is breaking up. If we are not out of it in a few minutes, we shall be buried under the ruin." She spoke as calmly as if she had been merely mentioning the time of day. "Come," she added, and held out her hand to each of the children. Polly, who was disliking the queen and feeling rather sulky, would not have let her hand be taken if she could have helped it. But though the queen spoke so calmly, her movements were as quick as thought. Before Polly knew what was happening, her left hand had been caught in a hand so much larger and stronger than her own that she could do nothing about it. This is a terrible woman, thought Polly. She's strong enough to break my arm with one twist. And now that she's got my left hand, I can't get at my yellow ring. If I tried to stretch across and get my right hand into my left pocket, I mightn't be able to reach it before she asked me what I was doing. Whatever happens, we mustn't let her know about the rings. I do hope Diggory has the sense to keep his mouth shut. I wish I could get a word with him alone. The queen led them out of the Hall of Images into a long corridor, and then through a whole maze of halls and stairs and courtyards. Again and again they heard parts of the great palace collapsing, sometimes quite close to them. Once a huge arch came thundering down only a moment after they had passed through it. The queen was walking quickly. The children had to trot to keep up with her, but she showed no sign of fear. Diggory thought, she's wonderfully brave and strong. She's what I call a queen. I do hope she's going to tell us the story of this place. She did tell them certain things as they went along. That is the door to the dungeons, she would say, or that passage leads to the principal torture chambers, or this was the old banqueting hall where my great-grandfather bade 700 nobles to a feast, and killed them all before they had drunk their fill. They had had rebellious thoughts. They came at last into a hall larger and loftier than any they had yet seen. From its size, and from the great doors at the far end, Diggory thought that now, at last, they must be coming to the main entrance. In this he was quite right. The doors were dead black, either ebony or some great black metal which is not found in our world. They were fastened with great bars, most of them too high to reach and all too heavy to lift. He wondered how they would get out. The queen let go of his hand and raised her arm. She drew herself up to her full height and stood rigid. Then she said something which they couldn't understand, but it sounded horrid, and made an action as if she were throwing something towards the doors. And those high and heavy doors trembled for a second, as if they were made of silk, and then crumbled away, till there was nothing left of them but a heap of dust on the threshold. "Whew!" whistled Diggory. "Has your master magician, your uncle, power like mine?" asked the queen, firmly seizing Diggory's hand again. "But I shall know later. In the meantime, remember what you have seen. This is what happens to things and to people who stand in my way." Much more light than they had yet seen in that country was pouring in through the now empty doorway, and when the queen led them out through it, they were not surprised to find themselves in the open air. The wind that blew in their faces was cold, yet somehow stale. They were looking from a high terrace, and there was a great landscape out below them. Low down and near the horizon hung a great red sun, far bigger than our sun. Diggory felt at once that it was also older than ours, a sun near the end of its life, weary of looking down upon that world. To the left of the sun, and higher up, there was a single star, big and bright. Those were the only two things to be seen in the dark sky. They made a dismal group. And on the earth, in every direction, as far as the eye could reach, there spread a vast city in which there was no living thing to be seen. And all the temples, towers, palaces, pyramids, and bridges cast long, disastrous-looking shadows in the light of that withered sun. Once a great river had flowed through the city, but the water had long since vanished, and there was now only a wide ditch of gray dust. "Look well on that which no eyes will ever see again," said the queen. Such was Charn, that great city, the city of the King of Kings, the wonder of the world, perhaps of all worlds. Does your uncle rule any city as great as this, boy?" "No," said Diggory. He was going to explain that Uncle Andrew didn't rule any cities, but the queen went on. "It is silent now, but I have stood here when the whole air was full of the noises of Charn. trampling of feet, the creaking of wheels, the cracking of the whips, and the groaning of slaves, the thunder of chariots, and the sacrificial drums beating in the temples. I have stood here, but that was near the end, when the roar of battle went up from every street, and the rivers of Charn ran red. She paused and added, all in one moment, one woman blotted it out forever. Who? Said Diggory in a faint voice, but he had already guessed the answer. I, said the queen. I, Jadis, the last queen, but the queen of the world. The two children stood silent, shivering in the cold wind. It was my sister's fault, said the queen. She drove me to it. May the curse of all the powers rest upon her forever. At any moment I was ready to make peace, yes, and to spare her life too, if only she would yield me the throne. But she would not. Her pride has destroyed the whole world. Even after the war had begun, there was a solemn promise that neither side would use magic. But when she broke her promise, what could I do? Fool! As if she did not know that I had more magic than she. She even knew that. I had the secret of the deplorable word. Did she think she was always a weakling, that I would not use it? What was it? Said Diggory. That was the secret of secrets, said the Queen Jadis. It had long been known to the great kings of our race that there was a word which, if spoken with the proper ceremonies, would destroy all living things except the one who spoke it. But the ancient kings were weak and soft-hearted, and bound themselves and all who should come after them with great oaths never even to seek after the knowledge of that word. But I learned it in a secret place, and paid a terrible price to learn it. I did not use it until she forced me to it. I thought to overcome her by every other means. I poured out the blood of my armies like water. Beast, muttered Polly. The last great battle, said the queen, raged for 3 days here in Charn itself. For 3 days I looked down upon it from this very spot. I did not use my power till the last of my soldiers had fallen, and the accursed woman, my sister, at the head of her rebels, was halfway up those great stairs that lead from the city to the terrace. Then I waited till we were so close that we could see one another's faces. She flashed her horrible, wicked eyes upon me and said, Victory. Yes, said I, victory, but not yours. Then I spoke the deplorable word. A moment later, I was the only living thing beneath the sun. But the people, gasped Diggory. What people, boy? Asked the queen. All the ordinary people, said Polly, who'd never done you any harm, and the women, and the children, and the animals. Don't you understand, said the queen, still speaking to Diggory. I was the queen. They were all my people. What else were they there for but to do my will? It was rather hard luck on them, all the same, said he. I had forgotten that you are only a common boy. How should you understand reasons of state? You must learn, child, that what would be wrong for you, or for any of the common people, is not wrong in a great queen such as I. The weight of the world is on our shoulders. We must be freed from all rules. Ours is a high and lonely destiny. Diggory suddenly remembered that Uncle Andrew had used exactly the same words, but they sounded much grander when Queen Jadis said them, perhaps because Uncle Andrew was not 7 feet tall and dazzlingly beautiful. And what did you do then? Said Diggory. I had already cast strong spells on the hall where the images of my ancestors sit, and the force of those spells was that I should sleep among them like an image myself, and neither need food nor fire, though it were 1,000 years, till one came and struck the bell and awoke me. Was it the deplorable word that made the sun like that? Asked Diggory. Like what? Said Jadis. So big, so red, and so cold. It has always been so, said Jadis, at least for hundreds of thousands of years. Have you a different sort of sun in your world? Yes, it's smaller and yellower, and it gives a good deal more heat. The Queen gave a long drawn "Ah," and Diggory saw in her face that same hungry and greedy look which he had lately seen on Uncle Andrew's. So, she said, yours is a younger world. She paused for a moment to look once more at the deserted city, and if she was sorry for all the evil she had done there, she certainly didn't show it, and then said, Now let us be going. It is cold here at the end of all the ages. Going where? Asked both the children. Where? Repeated Jadis in surprise. To your world, of course. Polly and Diggory looked at each other aghast. Polly had disliked the Queen from the first, and even Diggory, now that he had heard the story, felt that he had seen quite as much of her as he wanted. Certainly she was not at all the sort of person one would like to take home, and if they did like, they didn't know how they could. What they wanted was to get away themselves, but Polly couldn't get at her ring, and of course Diggory couldn't go without her. Diggory got very red in the face and stammered, Oh, our world. I didn't know you wanted to go there. What else were you sent here for, if not to fetch me? Said Jadis. I'm sure you wouldn't like our world at all, said Diggory. It's not her sort of place, is it, Polly? It's very dull, not worth seeing, really. It will soon be worth seeing when I rule it, said the Queen. Oh, but you can't, said Diggory. It's not like that. They wouldn't let you, you know. The Queen gave a contemptuous smile. Many great kings, she said, thought that they could stand against the house of Charn, but they all fell, and their very names are forgotten. Foolish boy, do you think that I, with my beauty and my magic, will not have your whole world at my feet before a year has passed? Prepare your incantations and take me there at once. This is perfectly frightful, said Diggory to Polly. Perhaps you fear for this uncle of yours, said Jadis. But if he honors me duly, he shall keep his life and his throne. I am not coming to fight against him. He must be a very great magician, if he has found how to send you here. Is he king of your whole world, or only of part? He isn't king of anywhere, said Diggory. You are lying, said the Queen. Does not magic always go with the royal blood? Who ever heard of common people being magicians? I can see the truth whether you speak it or not. Your uncle is the great king and the great enchanter of your world, and by his art he has seen the shadow of my face in some magic mirror or some enchanted pool, and for the love of my beauty he has made a potent spell which shook your world to its foundations and sent you across the vast gulf between world and world to ask my favor and to bring me to him. Answer me, is that not how it was? Well, not exactly, said Diggory. Not exactly, shouted Polly. Why, it's absolute bosh from beginning to end. Minions, cried the Queen, turning in rage upon Polly, and seizing her hair at the very top of her head where it hurts most. But in doing so, she let go of both the children's hands. Now, shouted Diggory. And quick, shouted Polly. They plunged their left hands into their pockets. They did not even need to put the rings on. The moment they touched them, the whole of that dreary world vanished from their eyes. They were rushing upward, and a warm green light was growing nearer overhead. And I think that's where I'm going to end for the night. Kind of on a little bit of a cliffhanger there. So I'm sorry for if the screen, the video seems to shake a little bit. I was trying to adjust the way I was sitting and trying to make sure I got a drink when I could. So hopefully you all don't mind. So I'm going to stop there and wish you all a good night. I will hopefully have another video up soon. Um, Hopefully maybe this week, if not, definitely by the end of the week, the weekend, I'll have the next part up. So, you all take care tonight. Hopefully this week will go better for all of us. So, everybody take care. Have a good night. And I'll be back with you all soon. Bye.